Today, I'm going to talk about Frigate, which is an NVR that has built-in object detection. It can run on all kinds of hardware platforms, but we're going to work with Home Assistant and the add-on. This is going to be a multi-part video because there's a lot to unpack. I don't know how many videos, so make sure you subscribe so you know when I put new videos up. And so today what we're going to talk about is the actual configuration and installation of the add-on, and then getting a camera going. And I'll show you how my configuration is set up. In the next upcoming series of videos, we'll talk about notifications and some custom configurations and maybe some work with the dashboards. So let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about what Frigate actually is. Frigate is an NVR with real-time object detection for IP cameras. It's a complete and local NVR designed for Home Assistant, and it has AI object detection. It uses TensorFlow and OpenCV to perform the object detection locally. So it does everything locally without going out to a cloud service such as Sentry or something else like that. Using a Coral accelerator is optional but highly recommended. In my testing, I started out by running a couple of cameras using just the CPU on my Odroid N2 Plus. And then I added the TPU and I was able to add 5 cameras. But as it says here, the Coral will outperform even the best CPUs and can process hundreds of frames per second with very little overhead. So if you're going to do this and you're going to use this setup, I recommend you get some sort of TensorFlow processing unit so that you can take the load off your CPU. Even some GPUs and stuff like that don't apply to this situation. You need a TPU because you don't have the option of running it against the GPUs. It has tight integration with Home Assistant via a custom component. It's designed to minimize resource usage and maximize performance by only looking for objects when and where necessary. So you can set up zones and masks and things like that, which we'll talk about either in this video or in a later video. Uses very low overhead motion detection to determine where to run the object detection. It runs with TensorFlow and a separate processes to maximize the frames per second. And then it communicates over MQTT for integration with other systems. So you get MQTT alerts and whatnot, and you can use that for all kinds of custom stuff. It records video clips of detected objects and snapshots. You can do 24/7 recording, and you can also take and restream RTMP streams to other things. So if you're running some other devices or things that you need to see the stream from, you can take the stream coming from your camera that goes into Frigate, re-encode that RTMP and send it back out as another stream. And then you're only hitting the camera with one stream instead of multiple streams. And that saves a load on your camera and it saves a load on your network as well. So that's Frigate in a nutshell. Let's start getting into how we add Frigate into Home Assistant and then just some configuration that I've got set up. Now we're going to talk about how we install this add-on into Home Assistant. It's got a couple of components. The first is going to be the add-on itself. And the second part is going to be the integration. And those two work together to bring in all of the information you need into Home Assistant. And there's a very detailed installation instruction on the Frigate website. So we're going to do the HACS OS add-on setup first. And in order to do that, we're going to navigate to Supervisor Add-on Store and Repositories. And we're going to put this actual repository into the list of available repositories. So we go to Supervisor, and we go into Add-on Store. We're going to add a repository, which we'll do here. Click on Add, and it's going to add this repository so you can install the actual Frigate add-on. And so you can see it here. So I can close this out now, and I can search the add-on store for Frigate. And you've got Frigate NVR Proxy, you've got Frigate NVR, and you've got Frigate NVR Beta. I'm going to go with this one right here. And I'm going to click Install, and it's going to go through and do the install. The amount of time it takes to install depends on your hardware. Now that Frigate is installed, we have another step before we can start it up. You need to create a file called frigate.yml in the root of your Home Assistant configuration directory. That is a requirement before you can do anything else. And for that, I'll use File Editor. I'll go into File Editor, and I'll create a new file called frigate.yml. Remember, it's not YAML like other files, it's YML. So frigate.yml. And I'm going to put some values in here that are going to get us started. The first thing you need to have is you need to make sure you have MQTT defined. So I'll do an entry for MQTT. Under MQTT, I'm going to specify the host name of my MQTT server, the port, which is a standard MQTT port. Topic prefix, you'll want to leave this as the default prefix, and I'm going to specify it here so I know what it is. So it's frigate. If you change the topic prefix, you're going to have to go into code, and you're going to have to make sure the code matches the topic prefix, or the integrations and sensors aren't going to work correctly. So there's topic prefix, client ID. I'm going to give that a name of frigate as well. User is going to be your MQTT user. So MQTT user YouTube. And your password for MQTT, you'll need to specify that as well. And that's going to be that, which I'll turn off after I'm done with the video, so don't worry about the security part. And you're going to want to set up your stats interval. I'll leave it for the default of 60 seconds. And it's going to send updates to through MQTT every 60 seconds on the stats of your frigate server. Okay, so that's the first required block. The second required block is going to be what kind of detector you're using. If you have a Coral or some other TPU, you're going to specify it here. And on the page under the frigate website that talks about detectors, there's a whole bunch of different detector types. You can have Coral, Edge TPU, USB, which is what I'm using. You can use more than one TPU. You can also use PCI devices. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of these you can use. To start with, you're going to have to at least specify the CPU if you don't have a TPU or some other device. Because used to be that frigate would default to CPU if nothing else was specified, but nowadays you have to explicitly specify the CPU. The assumption is most people are going to be using some sort of TPU device, and defaulting to CPU is hard on the CPU, and it's not the ideal solution for long-term use of this NVR setup. So for demonstration purposes today, though, I am going to use my detector as CPU, and I'm just going to kind of copy this section right here, and I'm going to paste it into my file. And this is the CPU that I will be, or this is the setup that I'll be using. Now you can go ahead and save it, and we'll go back over and we will try to start up the frigate NVR and see what happens. Now you don't have any cameras set up, obviously, so you're not going to get anything yet, but you will have the ability to make sure your MQTT is connected and that it starts up without error. And then we'll go back and we'll add in some camera configuration. All right, frigate has started up, and it tells you here that it's connected to MQTT. So everything is good in terms of being able to use this. Now we have no cameras set up, so it's not going to do anything at this point until we actually have something for it to look at. So let me take you into my configuration that I have set up on my production system, and I'll walk you through some of the camera settings that I have set up for my particular cameras. Now keep in mind that there are a ton of different cameras out there, and not every camera is going to have this exact format, especially when it comes to the RTSP URL that you're going to use to connect to the camera. So let's get over there and take a look. All right, I'm going to take you line by line in my configuration and show you how I've got my camera set up for the driveway camera. Now you're going to have a section in your YAML file, the frigate.yml file. Now remember, you have to do this stuff in frigate.yml. You can't do this in a UI editor, so you're going to have to be comfortable editing YAML. I've stressed this before in some of my other videos. It's not that hard. So don't get concerned or don't get discouraged if you can't edit the YAML. The one thing that you need to make sure of is that you format YAML correctly, and that means spacing and stuff like that has to be accurate. If you follow along with this, this will help you get set up on the basic settings. And then if you have errors, make sure you look at your log files when you start or restart Frigate, and it'll tell you where it sees the errors at. All right, so this is a camera section. So all of my cameras will be under the camera section. You have to give it a name. So I'm going to call this camera driveway. I'm going to be doing FFmpeg. That is pretty much the most common setup for using these frigate cameras. And then my inputs are going to be where I get the video feed from on my cameras. Now I have two different video feeds. I have a mainstream and I have a substream. Most cameras will allow you to do at least one mainstream and at least one substream. And the path starts with RTSP. And in my case, I have a username and password set on the camera, so I have to specify those. The IP address of the camera with the RTSP port, it defaults to 554 for most cameras. And then the rest of this part is determined by your camera manufacturer. Now this driveway camera is an Amcrest branded camera. I don't know if it's Amcrest, but it uses the Amcrest stuff. It might be a knockoff, but it does use the same URL platform or same URL for streaming RTSP as any other Amcrest. And there are websites you can look up your RTSP stream setups on. Now, the reason I have two of these inputs is I'm using one for detection and I'm using one for actually recording the clips. Now, a clip is what you are probably familiar with, which is the actual video recording of the thing that happened. The detection is the stream that Frigate is using in order to determine whether or not it should alert or record or create a snapshot and all that stuff. So these are the actual streams that I'm using, and then the roles that each one will do. Now, what's very important here are the width and height of the stream that you're using to do the detection with. In this case, this stream right here. And let me show you what that looks like on my camera itself. Now on the camera, I have a main stream and I have a substream, and that's what these two look like. If you come over here to settings, and again, this is very specific to your camera model, you will have to actually figure out how to set this up based on your camera model. But I look at video and I have the mainstream setting and then I have the substream setting. The mainstream is running at 1920 by 1080, so it's a 1080p stream at 30 frames per second. My substream is running at 640 by 480 at 5 frames per second. What this is going to do for you by using a substream for detection is to significantly reduce the overhead required for the CPU or the TPU to process the images. You don't need a full frame 1080p image for Frigate to detect objects in that feed or in that stream. If your camera has the capability of running a substream, use the substream for your detection. Flat out, no other way to say that. Make sure you're using that substream. Otherwise, you're going to end up with super high CPU. An example would be when I set this up initially, I had one camera running the 1920 by 1080, the 1080p stream here. It was running about 80% CPU for a single camera. When I dropped this down to the substream, the CPU is negligible for a single camera. So that's why it's important to use substreams when you're trying to use the detection part of this. All right, so we go back over here, and that's where we have the two different streams. And these channels are different these URLs are different based on the streams. You can use something like VLC and input this in VLC as a network stream, and if you have it correct, you'll see the network stream show up. The important part about this is that your substream or your detection stream has to match the width and the height that you're setting here. So 640 by 480 here, 640 by 480 here, and we always set it at 5 frames per second. You don't need 30 frames per second for it to detect objects. 5 frames per second will be just fine. If you want to watch the full frame, which I do, and you want the clip to be recorded in full 1080p resolution, make sure you specify a second path with a role of being the role that it records the clips. And then these are the objects now that I want to track. And again, it's just a list of objects: person, dog, bicycle, cat. Those are the 4 things that I'm most concerned with on my driveway camera. And then I want to set, if I want a separate threshold than what is default, which I believe is 0.7, the threshold here, I want a lower threshold. So I want persons to be detected more often than, or setting a lower threshold for detection of a person than I would normally. So I actually take this filter, set a person filter, and I set the threshold to 0.5. And for this camera, I want snapshots to be enabled. I want the timestamp false. I don't need that because it's already on the clip. Bounding box is true. And what a bounding box is is it shows the area that it detected whatever that object was. So in my snapshots, when I look at a snapshot, I'm going to see a bounding box with the object's detection area, and it'll tell me what it actually saw. That's especially good for troubleshooting. If you keep getting an object showing up in and it being recorded, looking at the snapshot will tell you where it is. You may want to mask that area out. It just depends on your setup. So the other option here is how long I want to retain the snapshots. The default, I think, is something like 10 days. Now I'm going to default it to 3 days. I only want to go back 3 days to look at on this camera, and this can be camera specific. On the driveway camera, only 3 days for snapshots and only 3 days for clips. Now this snapshot block we just talked about, but clips are the same thing. I want to enable clips and I want to retain value. And then the pre-capture is how many seconds of video shows up in the clip. It records or makes that clip for you. And it defaults to 5 seconds. So when I look at a clip, I'm watching about 2 or 3 seconds of nothing. And then it'll start seeing the object that was detected. So I've lowered that down to 3 seconds. And then I have zones and masks set up. Now I'm going to talk briefly about zones and masks. If we look at my driveway camera on the actual NVR, and this is what the NVR screen setup is for a single camera, I will see under options the ability to show zones and to show masks. And one of the things you're definitely going to want to do, and I'll show you this in a subsequent video, is that you want to make sure that you set masks around things like your clock. If your clock is coming from your camera, in this case, it does under Frigate because there's no way to overlay that. The actual camera feed is sending me the clock value or the time and date value. I want to mask that because that way Frigate doesn't have to be looking at that area and always trying to determine whether or not that's an object. As the seconds tick down, it's going to continually look at that area. That's going to increase your CPU usage unnecessarily. So you're going to want to make sure that you mask that area. And again, I'll show you that in a subsequent video. The other thing here to notice is zones. And you can set up zones, multiple zones if you want to, making sure they don't overlap for areas you're most interested in. In my case here, in my notifications, I only want to know when somebody enters this area right here. Because otherwise, I'm going to get everybody walking down the street, people walking over here, cats and dogs over here, and all of that. I'm not really interested in that, especially if I'm using this zone as a notification zone. That way, I'm only notified if something is close in to where I'm interested in, and I don't care about the rest. Now, with this zone set, it doesn't mean that you're not going to record clips. It's still going to look at this entire area for objects that you're interested in tracking. So I can actually filter events on this zone, or I can get notifications on this zone, but I can continue to record. So maybe I do want to know people walking down the street, because if something happens that I hear about in the neighborhood, I want to go back and check my camera events and see if I saw anything related to that. I will go ahead and record these things because they're not masked. If you don't care about anything but this area right here, you're going to want to create a mask that filters out all of the rest of this area. And in that case, Frigate won't even look at the area to determine whether or not there are objects involved there. It'll just ignore it all. But again, I'm interested in what's going on here. I just don't want to be notified unless it's getting close into where this area is in this zone. So that's the zone settings, and it's done on a polygon shape. You'll notice here we have coordinates, and there's actually a mask and zone creator that allows you to specify these masks and zones. And again, we'll talk about that later in a different video. And that's where you have zones, and you name each zone a specific name. You can't have the same name as the camera name, so make sure you don't name it the same as the camera. And then you have a motion mask as well. And that's the entirety of the basic settings for one camera. This is how you can install Frigate and get one camera running, and then you can track the different items here. Now, in subsequent videos, we'll go a little bit more in depth into zones and maskings and how you create those. In addition, I will show you how to create notifications so that you can get notified on your phone or device or whatever that someone's encroaching on the area that you're most interested in. It can be the zone we talked about or the entire frame of the camera. Now, before I go, I do want to show you a different RTSP stream URL from one of my other cameras that's different than what the AMCrest is. Now you can see here that this is an RTSP stream, and this is for an HIK vision camera or HIK vision or whatever you want to call it. This has a slightly different streaming URL than the AMCrest cameras. That's why it's important that you look up what your RTSP stream is and make sure you test that in VLC. And I'll give you an example of how I do that here. So let's look at this RTSP stream. I'm just going to copy this. This is our detect stream. Copy it. You can go into VLC here, under media, open network stream, and then you can paste that in here. And if you don't have a username or password specified, it will actually ask you for that. So I'm going to play it. It's going to ask me for a username and password, which I will give it. And if everything is correct, and it will actually give you a stream here. So make sure that you test it first before you start playing around with this so you know that these streams actually work. Once you have the add-on up and running, your next step is to install the integration. Now, when you install the integration, it's best to have your cameras configured first, because when you install it and configure it in Home Assistant, it's going to pick up your camera information from the configuration. I had to re-add the configuration once I was done adding my cameras because it didn't see the new ones that I added automatically. Now, restarting Home Assistant or restarting whatever may solve that, but that's the way I figured out to do it. So what you need to do is come over here to HACS, and if you don't have HACS installed, you need to install it. I have a whole video or 2 or 3 on doing stuff with HACS, so make sure you check that out. Click on the HACS link, and you're going to come over to Integrations, and you're going to click on this little button over here, which you can't see, Explore and Add Repositories. So we're going to click that button, and we're going to first start off, actually we're going to back up, we're going to go over here to Custom Repositories at the top. And before we can add the Frigate integration, we actually need to add a custom repository. And that custom repository is noted over here under Home Assistant, Installation and Configuration. This is the repository URL that you're going to use for the HACS custom repository. And I'm going to paste it in here, click my category. Let me move out of my way. Category here is going to be integration. Let me get it here, integration. And I'm going to add it. Now it tells me it already exists because I've already added it in here under the add-ons. What's confusing to me is that the add-ons and the HACS are different, but apparently they share the same repository maybe. I don't know, but it does show up automatically already. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore that. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to see if Frigate is already installed. So we come down all the way to the bottom here and show me all of the installed items. And I don't see it, so I'm just going to go ahead in here and search for Frigate. And here it is. So try that first. Try to install it without adding the custom repository. And once I've done that, you want to install this repository in HACS. And it tells me version 1.1.2 is the one that I'm interested in. And I'm going to go ahead and install it. All right, now it's installed, but it requires a restart. So if we go back over here to the HACS page, you'll see this, you have one integration that requires a restart. So I'm going to click on that. It's going to take me to the server controls page. I'm going to click on check configuration. Good, I'm going to restart. And so we'll wait a moment for this to go ahead and restart. Okay, so Home Assistant is finishing its startup. And as soon as it's finished here, which it is now, we can go back over and we can check and see that it shows up correctly under integrations. But now we'll see that Frigate is installed. All right, so now we've created the add-on, added the add-on, we've added the integration in or in HACS. Now we have to go over to configuration, integrations, and we're going to actually add the final piece here that bridges Home Assistant to the add-on. And this is going to be our Frigate configuration. So I'll click on Add Integration, search for Frigate. You're going to be asked for a URL here, and this is defaulting to the internal container URL, and I would just leave that alone as that's what you want, and then click on Submit. And now it will tell you what devices it found. We have our main frigate instance, our driveway camera, and our driveway close-in zone. So that's successful. And now you'll see over here 3 devices and 30 entities. Under those 30 entities, what we have now are all of these sensors that you can use in your automations and in all kinds of other things. And that's what we'll talk about in the next video. So you've got the Frigate add-on, you've got the HACS integration done, and then you've got the main Home Assistant integration all installed and ready to go. So with that, that is a basic setup of Frigate to get things up and running. One other thing to consider is what you're running this on. As of this video, there's no way to record anywhere other than the device that you're recording it on, unless you're running it in something like Proxmox or a VM or something where you have better access to the underlying directory structures. On Home Assistant, it's going to record into the media directory. And I don't know any other way around that at this point. So if you look at your media folder under Media Browser, you'll see Frigate creates these directories. Even if you mount your NAS, which I have shown in a different video, the media folder to your NAS, it's still not recording there. Also, if you're creating snapshots, make sure that you exclude the media directory if that's your preference, because it's going to try to record or try to back up your entire HA instance in your snapshot. In addition, it's going to also back up all these files in your media directory. So keep in mind the consideration of how long you want to store the media files in your Home Assistant instance. If you're doing this on a Raspberry Pi 4 with an SD card, you may want to consider using something like data CTL, and an external drive to move all of your writable directories, including the media folder, over to an external drive. That's how I run my Raspberry Pi 4. Everything that Home Assistant does to write and read and everything is done on the external drive. It just boots off the SD card. So keep in mind that the length of time you keep these clips, because storage right now is going to be limited to the amount of the size of your SD card, your external drive, or whatever you're doing. Also, in subsequent videos, I'll talk about some of the things that I've learned related to how this compares to Blue Iris. Make sure you watch this video, get things up and running, and then come back and watch my other videos on this topic, because I'll go more in depth in some of the other sections. I don't want to make this video super long to try to cover it all at once. Right now, you have the tools to get things up and running and start playing, and then again, we'll talk about more stuff later. If you have any questions, drop those down in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up. If you're not a channel member, I'd appreciate it if you join the channel. It helps me continue to make these videos, and we will see you on the next one.